Every rancher knows the land is more than dirt and grass. It's blood, sweat, and the pride of generations. But for me, it became a battleground. My ranch stretched wide under the sun, fields golden and skies clear. But my peace was shattered by two sisters who thought rules never applied to them. They were part of the HOA in town, loud, entitled, and full of arrogance. They called themselves protectors of the community, but out here, away from their manicured lawns, they had no authority. Still, they acted like they owned everything they touched. Week after week, they cut across my fields in their shiny white Range Rover, dust trailing behind them as they laughed and waved like my ranch was just their shortcut. I told them to stop. I warned them about the crops they crushed, the fences they broke, and the animals they spooked, but they didn't care. They mocked me, said I was just a grumpy farmer stuck in the past. That was the final straw. This wasn't just about property, it was about respect. I wasn't going to be bullied off my own land by two spoiled sisters with money and attitude. So, I set a trap. Not with violence, not with vengeance, but with planning, precision, and a little bit of country ingenuity. The day they came barreling across my field again, the sky was bright. The wheat swayed in the breeze, and I was ready. Their arrogance had met its match, and when the earth itself erupted beneath their tires, launching their precious Range Rover into the air, their faces twisted in shock and rage, that was the moment they learned. My ranch isn't a shortcut. It's a line they never should have crossed. Asterisk, the morning sun stretched across the wide horizon, spilling light over the golden fields of my ranch. It was the kind of view that reminded me why I chose this life, a quiet expanse where the earth met the sky, and a man could hear his own thoughts. I leaned against the weathered fence post, the grain rough beneath my hand, and drew in the scent of wheat and dry dirt. It should have been a perfect day. Out here, away from the noise of town, time slowed down, and the rhythm of life belonged to the land. But peace is a fragile thing, and mine had been broken long ago by two women who thought the rules of the world did not apply to them. The white Range Rover appeared in the distance like a scar across the land. Its polished body gleamed under the sun, too clean, too perfect against the dust it kicked up behind it. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to squint to know who was behind the wheel. The HOA sisters, two women from town who had made it their mission to torment me with their arrogance. They were well known for their loud voices at community meetings, their iron grip on petty neighborhood rules, and their unshakable belief that money gave them the right to anything. Out here, they had no business, no authority. But to them, my ranch was nothing more than a shortcut, a patch of ground they could trample whenever they pleased. I watched the Rover tear across the wheat as though the field was just another paved street. The tires crushed stalks I had nurtured for months. The wheat bent and snapped, left behind in ragged lines. They didn't slow down. They didn't look around to see the damage they left. Instead, laughter floated from the open windows, carried by the breeze. I heard one of them yell something, though the words were lost to the distance, drowned out by the growl of the engine and the roar of my own blood in my ears. It wasn't the first time. No, this had been happening for weeks. At first I thought it was an accident, a single wrong turn from drivers too careless to tell one road from another. I let it slide. Then it happened again, and again, until it became a pattern I could no longer ignore. Every time their luxury SUV streaked across my land, I felt something inside me chip away. It wasn't just about the crops or the fences. It was about respect. This land wasn't just dirt. It was my livelihood, my pride, and my heritage. To them, it was nothing more than a patch of scenery to cut through on their way to wherever they thought was more important. The worst part was the way they mocked me when I confronted them. I remembered the day clearly, the sun beating down as I stood at the edge of my property, waiting. The sisters slowed just enough for me to step out and wave them down. My heart hammered in my chest, not from fear but from anger held too long. I told them straight, this is my land. Stop driving across it. My voice was steady, but my hands curled into fists at my sides. They looked at each other and laughed. The driver, wearing oversized sunglasses that reflected the blue sky, tilted her head. "Oh, relax," she said, her tone dripping with dismissal. "It's just a field." The other leaned forward from the passenger seat, her grin sharp and mocking. "You should be thankful," she added, "that a car like this is even touching your boring land. Most people never see one up close." They both burst out laughing, the sound slicing through me like a blade. I stood there, stunned for a moment, watching their taillights fade into the dust. That was the day I realized they weren't just careless, they were cruel. They enjoyed making me feel small. They enjoyed treating my ranch like a playground, a joke, a stage for their arrogance. I walked back to the house that day with my jaw set and my heart heavy. The golden fields around me, usually my comfort, felt violated. Every crushed stalk of wheat was a reminder of how little they cared. Weeks passed, and each time I heard the distant hum of that engine, the anger in me grew heavier. I tried to distract myself with chores, mending fences, checking cattle, tending to the wheat, but it was always there, like a shadow. When you work the land, you give it everything, your sweat, your time, your strength. To see it treated as worthless by people who had never lifted a shovel in their lives, it cut deeper than words could explain. Neighbors told me to call the sheriff, but I knew how that would go. The sisters had money, connections, and the kind of slippery charm that could turn the tables on anyone. Out here, men like me had to solve problems our own way. Not with violence, but with grit, patience, and a plan. One afternoon, I stood in the middle of the dirt track they always used, staring at the ruts their tires had carved into the earth. My boots pressed into the soil, dry and cracked from their abuse. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing through the open air. I thought about my father and grandfather, men who had worked this same ground before me. They wouldn't have let anyone trample it without consequence. Neither would I. That was the moment the decision settled into me like a stone. I was done waiting. As I walked back to the barn, the sun warm on my back, an idea began to form. I didn't want to hurt them, not really. I wasn't that kind of man, but I wanted to make a point they couldn't laugh away, a lesson they couldn't ignore, something dramatic, something unforgettable, something that would shake their arrogance right out of them. The Range Rover roared past again later that evening, its tires spraying dirt as though mocking my thoughts. I watched from the porch, silent, my hands gripping the railing so tightly the wood groaned. I knew then that the next time they came, things would be different. My ranch wasn't theirs to trample. They were about to find that out, and when they did, their laughter would turn to silence. The next morning broke clear and bright, the kind of day that painted the land in sharp colors. The sky stretched blue and endless, the fields shimmered in gold, and a light breeze moved across the wheat in soft waves. To anyone else, it would have been a picture of calm, but to me it was another reminder that calm never lasted long. Not with those two sisters prowling the roads in their Range Rover. I woke early, even before the roosters crowed, my mind restless from the decision I had made the night before. My ranch wasn't just a piece of property. It was a living, breathing extension of me. Every fence post I had hammered, every furrow of soil I had plowed, every calf I had pulled from its mother on a cold spring night, it all meant something. And every time those women drove through, laughing as they tore across the earth, it was like they were spitting on all that work. I poured myself a cup of coffee, its bitter heat grounding me as I sat at the table. The wood creaked under my weight, the same table my father had eaten at every morning before he went to work the land. I could almost see him there, stern-eyed, steady-handed, reminding me that a man has to stand up for what's his. He'd say, "Respect isn't given, son. It's taken when it has to be." Those words echoed in me now. By the time the sun was fully up, I had walked the track the sisters always used. Their tire marks were there, cutting a deep groove into the soil like a wound that wouldn't heal. The damage was worse than I thought. Wheat stalks lay crushed, flattened into the dirt, and part of the fencing nearby had been bent where they must have clipped it weeks before. My anger burned hot, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I studied the land with a careful eye, thinking about how to turn it into a lesson they'd never forget. It had to be something powerful, something that would shake them but not cross the line into cruelty. I wasn't out for blood. I wasn't looking to put anyone in the hospital. What I wanted was respect, plain and simple. The kind of respect that only comes when arrogance meets a wall it can't knock down. I went to the barn and rummaged through supplies. Years of working the ranch had left me with all sorts of odds and ends: metal piping, heavy tools, rope, spare posts, even some small charges I'd once used to break apart stubborn earth for digging. Harmless when handled right, but loud and dramatic if set off under the open sky. As I stood there among the smell of hay and old leather, I began to see the plan clearly. The sisters always came down the same dirt path, the same stretch of road that cut between the wheat fields. If I buried one of those charges just beneath the surface and rigged it to a remote, it would give them the shock of their lives. No one would be hurt, but their shiny SUV would catch air, and the explosion of dust and dirt would make sure they understood what kind of man they were dealing with. I spent hours preparing. First, I tested the charges out in a dry patch far from the fields. The blast was everything I hoped for: loud, dusty, enough to rattle bones without breaking them. Then I dug carefully along the dirt path, making sure the hole was deep enough to hide the setup but not so deep that the effect would be lost. I laid everything in place with the precision of a surgeon, then covered it with soil until it looked as undisturbed as any other stretch of road as I worked. Sweat rolled down my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't stop. The sun burned high overhead, yet I felt a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity. Every shovelful of dirt I moved, every adjustment I made to the setup, it felt like I was hammering back the line those sisters had crossed so many times. When the trap was finally complete, I stood back and admired the work. Nothing looked out of place. To anyone driving by, it was just another dusty stretch of ranch road, but I knew what lay beneath, waiting. I brushed the dirt from my hands and wiped my brow, then tucked the remote into my pocket. The weight of it was solid and reassuring. That evening, as the light softened and the fields glowed in the golden hour, I stood on the porch with the remote resting in my palm. The land was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the rustle of wind through the wheat. I felt both anxious and calm all at once. I knew the sisters would come again. They always did. Their arrogance was as predictable as the sunrise. The only question was when. The next day came and went without sight of the rover. I tried to distract myself with chores, feeding the cattle, checking the irrigation lines, but my eyes kept straying toward that dirt path, waiting. When nothing happened, I went to bed restless, the remote still on the nightstand beside me. On the third day I finally heard it, the faint hum at first, low and distant, then growing into the distinct growl of an engine I had come to know too well. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the east, the same direction they always approached from. I stepped onto the porch, the sun blazing high, and there it was, the white Range Rover gliding across the horizon, dust trailing behind like a storm cloud. They were coming fast, windows down, music blaring. Even from where I stood, I could hear their laughter, sharp and mocking, carried by the wind. My hands tightened around the remote. This was the moment. As the SUV sped onto the dirt path, the very track where my trap lay buried, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The field swayed around me, golden and endless, the sky bright and merciless above. I thought of my father, my grandfather, all the men who had worked this land before me. This was for them as much as for me. The rover hit the trigger point. My thumb pressed the button. The ground erupted with a roar that split the air wide open. A thunderous crack rolled across the fields, shaking the earth beneath my boots. Dust and dirt exploded skyward in a violent cloud, twisting and churning in the sunlight like a storm born from the ground itself. In that instant, the peaceful ranch road transformed into chaos. The Range Rover lifted clear off the track. Its gleaming white body jolted upward as though some giant hand had plucked it from the earth. For a moment, time seemed to slow. I saw the sisters' faces through the windshield, twisted with shock and fear. Their mouths opened wide, screaming words I couldn't hear. Their sunglasses knocked askew. The SUV hung in the air almost gracefully, suspended against the brilliant blue sky. Wheat stalks bent from the blast, debris swirled around the rising vehicle, and the sound of tearing rubber and grinding metal rang through the dust-filled air. Then gravity reclaimed its prize. The rover slammed back to the ground with a jarring crunch, its suspension groaning under the impact. The tires skidded, spitting dirt, before the vehicle lurched sideways and came to a stop in a choking haze of smoke and dust. For several long seconds, silence swallowed the land, broken only by the ringing in my ears and the frantic honking of a horn caught beneath the sisters' fists. I stood frozen on the porch, the remote still clutched in my hand, my breath locked tight in my chest. I had done it. The trap had sprung exactly as planned, loud, shocking, but not deadly. Relief mingled with adrenaline, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. My fields, my land, had answered back. And now, the sisters who mocked me, who laughed as they tore across my ranch, had no choice but to face the consequences. Slowly, I began walking toward them. The dirt road stretched out like a battlefield, smoke still curling from the crater I had made. My boots pressed into the soil, steady and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of years of frustration and anger. As I neared the SUV, I could hear the sisters more clearly now, cursing, voices shrill with outrage. The driver, her hands trembling on the wheel, slammed her palm against the horn again and again. The passenger had thrown open her door, stumbling out with dust coating her hair and face. She looked at me with wild eyes, her expression caught between fury and disbelief. "You maniac," she screamed, pointing a finger at me like an accusation sharp enough to cut. "You could have killed us." I stopped a few yards away, close enough to see the scratches etched across the SUV's glossy paint, close enough to feel their panic pouring out of them. My face stayed calm, my voice steady as stone. "I warned you," I said simply. The driver finally shoved her door open and stepped out, coughing through the dust. Her blouse, once bright and clean, was now smeared with dirt. Her sunglasses dangled crookedly from one ear. She stomped toward me, her fingers stabbing the air with each word. "You've gone too far. Do you have any idea who we are? We'll have you arrested, sued, ruined." Her voice cracked with rage, but beneath it I heard something else: fear, real fear, the kind of fear that comes when arrogance collides with reality. I let her finish, then shook my head slowly. "This is my land," I told her. "Not a shortcut, not your playground. You don't get to come out here and trample it like it's nothing. Not anymore." The passenger gasped, throwing her hands into the air. "You're insane. Absolutely insane. We were just driving." "You can't do this." "Just driving." I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto hers. "You've been warned more times than I can count. You've crushed my wheat, broken my fences, scared off my cattle, and every time I asked you to stop, you laughed in my face. Tell me, what was I supposed to do?" They both froze for a moment, their anger faltering as the truth sank in. The dust swirled around us, catching the sunlight in a hazy glow, as though the land itself was waiting for their answer. But neither of them spoke. Their mouths worked soundlessly, caught between denial and guilt. The driver finally broke the silence with a bitter laugh, though her voice shook. "You think this is over? You think you've won? We'll see about that. We'll call the sheriff, the county, the HOA will make sure you regret this." Her words didn't rattle me. If anything, they sounded hollow, desperate. I stood my ground, the wheat swaying gently behind me in stark contrast to the chaos of the moment. "You do what you have to," I replied. But no, this you set one more tire on my land, and next time it won't just be dust and dirt you're dealing with. This is your last warning." For a long moment, the sisters glared at me, their faces red with anger, their pride wounded deeper than any scratch on their car. Then, without another word, they climbed back into the Rover. The engine coughed and sputtered before roaring back to life. They spun the tires, spitting dirt in my direction, but this time they didn't cut through the fields. They turned sharply toward the county road, their SUV bouncing awkwardly over the ruts as it fled. I stood there until the dust cloud settled, and the sound of their engine faded into silence. Only then did I let out a long, steady breath, the tension draining from my body. My hands still trembled slightly, the remote heavy in my pocket, but a calm settled over me like the warmth of the sun. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. The fields around me swayed gently in the breeze, untouched by tire tracks, golden and endless once more. I walked back toward the house, each step lighter than the last. The sisters might threaten me with lawsuits, with sheriffs and papers and HOA meetings, but deep down I knew the truth. They wouldn't dare come back. Their arrogance had been shaken, their laughter silenced. My ranch wasn't just dirt under their wheels anymore. It was a line they had finally learned not to cross. That night, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, I sat on the porch and watched the horizon. The land stretched out before me, calm and proud. The day had been loud, dramatic, and unforgettable, but now the silence felt earned. The sisters' screams still echoed faintly in my ears, but so did their fear, and that was enough. I sipped a fresh cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool evening air, and thought about the generations before me. My father would have approved. My grandfather too. The ranch had been defended, not with guns or violence, but with ingenuity and resolve. And as I looked out across the wheat swaying in the twilight, I knew that tomorrow would bring peace, at least for now. 3 days passed after the explosion, and for a while I allowed myself to believe it was over. The sisters hadn't returned, and the dirt path lay empty, untouched. The wheat stood tall and unbroken, swaying gently as though the land itself had taken a deep breath of relief. But peace doesn't last long when people like them are involved. Their pride had been dented, their egos bruised, and I knew they wouldn't let it go quietly. The first sign of trouble came in the form of dust on the horizon, but it wasn't their Range Rover this time. It was a county sheriff's cruiser, its lights flashing lazily in the morning sun. My stomach sank, though I wasn't surprised. I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, as the car pulled up to the front of the ranch. Sheriff Davis stepped out, a broad man with a weathered face and tired eyes. He had the look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Mornin', Hank," he said, tipping his hat. "Mornin', Sheriff," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "What brings you out here?" He sighed, glancing at his notepad as if it carried the weight of the world. "Got a complaint filed against you. 2 ladies from town say you set off an explosive on your property that nearly killed them." I couldn't help the small smile tugging at my lips. Nearly killed them? That's a stretch. Davis gave me a long look. "Did you or didn't you set something off out here?" "I set something off," I admitted, straight as a fence post. "But it was harmless. Just dust and noise. Enough to scare, not to hurt. You know as well as I do they've been tearing across my land for months." I asked them to stop. They didn't listen. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, clearly torn. He'd heard the same story as I had. The whispers about the sisters throwing their weight around in town, bending rules to suit themselves. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Look, Hank, between you and me, I don't think you did anything worth arresting over. But they're riled up. They've been calling the office every hour, threatening lawsuits, demanding action. You know how people like that are." "I know," I said, "and I'm not afraid of them." Davis nodded slowly. "Just be careful. They've got money, connections. They'll try to use the system against you if they can't beat you outright." He tipped his hat again, climbed back into his cruiser, and drove off, leaving a trail of dust that faded into the horizon. I stood there for a long time, staring after him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The sisters weren't finished, not by a long shot, and if they couldn't rattle me face to face, they'd try to bury me in paper and politics. That afternoon, it started. A man in a suit showed up at the gate, briefcase in hand, his shoes sinking awkwardly into the dirt. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing the HOA, rattling off accusations about property damage, reckless endangerment, and emotional trauma. I listened in silence, my jaw tight, before finally cutting him off. "You tell your clients this," I said firmly. "This is my land. They trespass again. They'll get the same treatment. I don't care how many papers you wave in my face. Out here, respect comes first." The lawyer blustered for a while, threatened court dates and legal fees, but I didn't flinch. Eventually, he left, muttering under his breath as he fumbled with the lock on the gate. By the end of the week, the town was buzzing with gossip. At the feed store, old Jim leaned across the counter and whispered, "Heard you gave those HOA ladies a scare they'll never forget." At the diner, a waitress smiled and asked if I'd really launched their Rover into the sky. Everywhere I went, people had heard some version of the story. Some shook their heads, calling me reckless, but most grinned wide. their eyes gleaming with the kind of satisfaction only justice can bring. But the sisters weren't done. On the 7th day, they came themselves not in their Rover, but in a shiny rental car. They pulled up just outside the gate, stepping out with clipboards in hand and fire in their eyes. I walked over slowly, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. "You think you scared us?" the older one snapped, her voice sharp as barbed wire. "You've just made things worse for yourself," the younger one chimed in, her arms crossed tightly. "We've spoken with the county. We're pushing for restrictions on your land, noise violations, safety inspections. We'll make sure this ranch of yours is so tied up in red tape, you won't even be able to breathe without our say-so." I looked at them both, their faces flushed with anger, their arrogance still clinging to them like perfume. For a moment I almost laughed. They thought they could drown me in paperwork, smother me with regulations, but they didn't understand that out here, life was simpler, tougher. Men like me weren't so icily broken. "You've already lost," I told them, my voice calm and steady, "because now you know this land isn't yours to take, and every time you look at that Rover of yours, scratched and dented, you'll remember what happens when you forget it." Their mouths tightened into thin lines, their eyes burning with rage. Without another word, they turned and climbed back into their car, slamming the doors so hard the sound echoed across the fields. The tires spun in the dirt as they sped away, leaving behind only dust and the bitter scent of their anger. That evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the ranch in warm light, I sat on the porch and thought about the battle ahead. I knew they weren't finished. They'd call more lawyers, send more papers, stir up more trouble. But I also knew something they didn't. The land had a way of protecting its own. Out here, the truth was written in the soil, in the sweat of a man's brow, in the quiet strength of generations. No matter how hard they pushed, they couldn't take that from me. The wheat swayed gently in the breeze, golden and proud, and I felt a calm resolve settle deep in my chest. The fight wasn't over, but I was ready. Let them bring their lawsuits, their threats, their anger. I had something stronger. I had the land, and the land had me. The days that followed were tense, but quiet. The sisters had retreated into town after their threats at my gate, but I knew better than to believe silence meant surrender. People like them didn't let go of grudges easily. Their pride had been bruised, their reputation cracked, and now they were scrambling to patch themselves back together. The talk around town only made things worse for them at the diner. Folks whispered with amusement about how their shiny Range Rover had gone flying. At the hardware store, men chuckled as they nudged each other and asked if I was arming the whole ranch with landmines. Word spread faster than tumbleweeds on a windy day, and soon the sisters had become the punchline of half the county's jokes. That was something they couldn't stand. Mockery cut them deeper than any bruise. I knew they'd strike again, but I didn't expect the form it would take. One afternoon, I was fixing the irrigation pump when I spotted them driving up the county road, not in their Rover, but in that rental again. This time, though, they weren't alone. Behind them rolled two black SUVs, sleek and polished, clearly out of place on a dusty rural road. They stopped at the gate, engines idling, and out stepped men in tailored suits, lawyers. The sisters stayed behind, glaring at me from inside the rental, while their representatives strode forward with clipboards, cameras, and They claimed they were here for an inspection, demanded access to my land under some flimsy pretext of county safety regulations. I stood tall by the gate, the sun hot on my shoulders, and refused. "You don't set foot past this gate without a warrant," I said flatly, "and you won't find a judge in this county who'll give you one for what you're trying to pull." The lead lawyer adjusted his tie, clearly unaccustomed to being denied by a rancher in dusty boots. "We'll see about that," he said coldly. "You can't defy us forever." "Maybe not," I replied, "but I can defy you today." And with that, I turned my back on them and walked away, leaving them sputtering in the dust. That was the turning point. They had thrown everything at my sheriff's lawyers, threats, and intimidation, and none of it stuck. The town knew their game, the sheriff knew his limits, and I knew something they didn't. The land doesn't bend to paper or pride. The land bends only to the hands that work it. For a few days after that confrontation, the road to my ranch was quiet again. The sisters didn't return, and neither did their lawyers. Slowly, the weight on my chest began to lift. I mended the damaged fence where their Rover had once clipped it, replanted the wheat along the crushed path, and patched the road where my trap had left its scar. The earth, stubborn and resilient, began to heal, and so did I. One evening, as the sun sank low and the horizon glowed orange, I spotted a lone car parked near the county road. It was them. The sisters stood outside the rental, staring toward the ranch. Their shoulders sagged, their postures softer than I had ever seen. For a long while, they didn't move, didn't shout, didn't wave. They just looked. I walked toward the fence, meeting their eyes across the distance. No words passed between us, but I saw it there, the acceptance. They finally understood. This land wasn't theirs to conquer. It wasn't a shortcut or a playground. It was mine, and they were done trying to take it. Without a word, they climbed back into the car and drove off, their dust trail fading into the twilight. And with that, the battle was over. The The weeks that followed were peaceful. No more tire tracks across the wheat. No more laughter mocking me from afar. The sisters retreated into their HOA kingdom, where they could fuss over lawn heights and mailbox colors to their heart's content. Out here, though, the land was mine, again quiet, steady, alive. As I sat on the porch one night, coffee mug in hand, I thought about everything that had happened. About the fear in their eyes when the Rover lifted into the air. About the fury they tried to unleash through the sheriff, the lawyers, the endless threats. And about the silence at the end. The unspoken acknowledgement that they had finally been beaten not by violence, but by a man's refusal to bend. The ranch stretched wide before me, bathed in moonlight now, proud and unbroken. My father and grandfather would have been proud. The line had been defended, the respect reclaimed, and I knew, deep down, that they wouldn't dare cross it again. The land was safe. The peace had returned. And as I watched the wheat sway gently under the stars, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. The kind that runs deeper than anger, deeper than pride. The kind that comes when justice, in its own rough, dusty way, is finally served.